Logic games was the most learnable and perfectible section of the LSAT, which raises the question, if logic games are no longer on the test, will it be harder to get a top score? Today I'll break down this question for you. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. And at first, logic games was the hardest section for me. I totally bombed it, barely any better than blind guessing when I first attempted it. It ended up being probably my favorite section and the one that was most consistent for me because the patterns in logic games are a lot more obvious, a lot more apparent. In logical reasoning and reading comp, you have these perceived ambiguities of language. And when you looked at students who got top scores on the old LSAT format, they typically scored perfect on logic games, maybe -1, and they were losing most of their points on each of the other sections. The logic games section was also responsible for the biggest LSAT score increases we would see, where students would improve 20 points or 30 points. Typically, a lot of that improvement came from the logic games section. So we can expect going forward, given that the LSAT will no longer have the logic games section, we can expect that the typical student will start with a higher cold diagnostic and see a smaller typical score increase. And so, for example, if before a student got a cold diagnostic of, say, a 145 and ended up with a score of a 170, now you might see that same student start with a cold diagnostic of a 155 and increase to a 170. Something perhaps along those lines. In other words, it's a little bit harder to improve on logical reasoning or reading comp on average because the reading related sections are perhaps a bit more familiar to the typical pre-law student than the logic games section would be. Now, how does all of this translate into one's ultimate LSAT score? It probably means that your typical student scoring in the 170s is going to get more questions wrong because you're not going to see as many perfect sections of logical reasoning or reading comp as you would for logic games. But does that translate into lower LSAT scores out of 180? That's a totally separate question. And the thing is, LSAC wants to keep things as consistent as possible, and they can very easily adjust the raw score conversions, aka the curve, to account for this. We have seen a lot of changes in LSAT percentiles over the years. It used to be, for example, even just a couple of years back, you could have a 99th percentile LSAT score with a 173. Now you've got to get a 175 to be in the 99th percentile. And so LSAT score inflation has led to significant percentile changes. LSAT may want to reduce that inflation a little bit by making the raw score conversions a bit tougher, but that's a totally separate question from the impact of logic games being on the test or not, because LSAT could simply say, we're going to allow you to get more questions wrong and still get a given LSAT score. But counteracting this is the fact that LSAT score inflation is so out of control that Yale Law has an LSAT median of 175, and all of the T14 law schools have LSAT medians of 170 or above. This doesn't have any relation, however, to logic games being on the test or not. This is a totally separate issue, most likely caused by the fact that LSAC has become much more liberal in recent years about granting accommodations for extra time on the LSAT. It used to be they only approved roughly 70% of requests for extra time accommodations. Now they approve 98% of requests, meaning basically if you fill out the forms properly, you dot your I's, you cross your T's, you get your doctor's note from a qualified professional, that will probably get you whatever it is you ask for, whether it's time and a half, double time, triple time, or more. This doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon because LSAC has gotten sued so many times for being too strict in the past about granting accommodations. The pendulum has now swung the other way, and they've become probably far too liberal in granting these accommodations. And so if this isn't changing anytime soon, the only thing LSAC can really do about this is they can make it harder to get a top score by requiring you to get more questions right in order to get a given score out of 180. But the fact remains, the LSAT format has changed. No more logic games, double logical reasoning. The biggest thing you can probably do is double your focus on logical reasoning, since it's now 2/3 of the test, and any gains you make in your understanding of logical reasoning will be doubled across those two sections. If you'd like my help with logical reasoning, reading comp, or anything else, I'd be glad to help. You can check out the links below to find out more and to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. And in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.